Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
Late one night, a trucker named Greg was driving down a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere. He'd been on the road for hours, with only the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of headlights from passing vehicles to keep him company. The miles seemed to stretch on endlessly, the empty road swallowing any signs of life. Greg had driven this route many times, but tonight felt different. There was a weight in the air, an unsettling feeling gnawing at the back of his mind. Around 2 a.m., his headlights caught a figure by the side of the road. It was a man, ragged and disheveled, standing near an old rusted vehicle that seemed to have broken down. At first, Greg thought it might be a hitchhiker, but something about the man's posture felt off. The figure didn't wave for help, nor did he seem to move at all, just standing there, unmoving, staring into the distance. Greg slowed down, unsure of what to do. He wasn't one to pick up strangers, especially on such a lonely stretch of highway. But there was something strangely compelling about the scene. He rolled down his window slightly and called out to the man. "Hey, you need some help?" Greg shouted into the night, but the figure didn't respond. The only sound that answered was the eerie whistle of the wind. Something in Greg's gut told him to keep driving, to avoid getting involved. But as he was about to accelerate and continue on his way, the figure suddenly moved, not toward him, but toward the broken down vehicle. The man didn't walk, didn't run, he just glided. His feet barely seemed to touch the ground. Greg's heart pounded in his chest as the figure disappeared into the darkness, and for a split second, Greg thought he saw something unnatural in the man's eyes, something that wasn't human. Shaking his head, Greg pushed the accelerator and sped down the road. But that sense of unease didn't leave him. It followed him, lingering like a shadow in his rearview mirror. Minutes passed, then hours. The road remained deserted, stretching endlessly in front of him. His eyelids began to grow heavy, the exhaustion of the long drive creeping up on him. Greg decided to pull over at the next rest stop to stretch his legs and clear his mind. He hadn't seen any other cars for miles, but as he turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold night, he heard something. A faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on a window. He spun around, expecting to see someone at his truck, but no one was there. The rest stop was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But the knocking continued, coming from somewhere near the back of his truck. Greg cautiously walked around to the rear, his heart racing. There, in the dim light, he saw it. The same man, standing just beyond the truck. The figure was grinning now, and it wasn't the grin of someone who had been stranded. It was a grin of someone who knew exactly what was happening and who had no intentions of letting Greg leave. Frozen with fear, Greg tried to back away, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, that unnerving, unnatural smile stretched across his face, his eyes gleaming with an almost predatory hunger. In a sudden burst of panic, Greg jumped back into his truck and locked the doors, the engine still running. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He didn't know what the hell was going on, but he knew he needed to get away, fast. He threw the truck into gear and sped down the highway, barely noticing the strange, dark shape that seemed to appear and disappear at the edge of his headlights. It was the man again, but now he wasn't alone. There were others, shadows, figures standing in the distance. Greg could feel their eyes on him as he drove, but every time he looked back, they vanished into the night. He drove for what felt like hours, but when he finally reached the next town, something was horribly wrong. The gas station was abandoned, the lights flickering ominously. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of the parking lot, stood the same broken down vehicle from before, the one with the man in it. The man was still there, standing motionless by the side of the road, his eyes fixed on Greg's truck as he passed. Greg's blood ran cold as he realized that the man hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't walked, hadn't gotten into the truck, hadn't done anything, yet somehow he had followed him. In that moment, Greg understood. This wasn't just a man stranded on the side of the road. This was something else, something that was hunting him, something that was following him, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. He never spoke about what happened that night, but every time he drives that route now, Greg makes sure never to stop. Because sometimes the road has a way of remembering you, and there are things out there that never really leave you alone.
Story number 2.
It was a cold, moonless night when trucker Jeff found himself alone on the highway, miles from any sign of life. He'd been driving through the Midwest for hours, a long haul from one small town to the next. The road stretched ahead of him, seemingly endless. The truck's headlights illuminated nothing but the thick, swirling fog ahead, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. His eyes were growing heavy from exhaustion, but he knew he needed to keep going. The radio was static, the only other company on this desolate stretch of road. Around 2 a.m., Jeff saw something in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light or his tired eyes playing games with him, but as the seconds passed, the figure became clearer. A man standing by the side of the road. He was tall, hunched over, and wearing ragged clothes. At first, Jeff thought it might be a hitchhiker, but as he drew closer, he noticed something strange. The man wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight ahead. Jeff's gut twisted with unease, but he told himself he wasn't one to ignore someone in need, even in the middle of nowhere. He slowed the truck down, rolled down the window, and called out, "Hey, you need help?" There was no response. The man didn't even acknowledge him. He just stood there, still, as if frozen in time. The hair on the back of Jeff's neck stood up. He was used to seeing all sorts of weird things on the road, but this was different. There was an unnatural stillness to the figure. Something didn't feel right. Without thinking too much, Jeff pushed the pedal down, speeding away from the eerie sight. The truck rumbled down the road, but Jeff couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still there, in the shadows, watching him. His mind raced as the miles passed. He tried to focus, but the feeling of being followed lingered in his thoughts. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few seconds, but the road was empty, just fog and darkness, stretching for miles. After a while, he noticed something odd. In the distance, a pair of headlights appeared behind him, far off at first, but rapidly gaining speed. It wasn't a car. It was too large, too fast. It was another truck, and it was closing in on him fast. Jeff wasn't sure why, but the idea of another truck on this road in the middle of nowhere filled him with dread. He had been driving for hours and hadn't seen another vehicle. The truck came up behind him, pulling alongside him. Jeff glanced over and saw the driver's face, pale and wide-eyed, staring at him. The truck's headlights cast an eerie glow over the man's expression, and Jeff felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something wrong with this driver. He was frantic, shaking, and his eyes were wild. As the truck sped past, the man's face twisted into an awful, silent scream, and then the truck disappeared into the fog. It didn't pass completely, it just vanished. One moment it was there, the next, it was gone. Jeff slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He pulled over to the shoulder of the road, unable to make sense of what had just happened. The fog had thickened, and everything felt suffocating. His hands gripped the wheel, cold sweat forming on his forehead. He wasn't alone. He knew it. The unsettling feeling returned with a vengeance. The hair on his neck stood on end. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping. It came from the back of the truck. At first it was soft, almost like a distant knocking. But then it grew louder. Each tap was sharper, closer. Panic surged through Jeff. He didn't want to check, but he knew he had to. He slowly got out of the truck, stepping onto the gravel shoulder. The night air was frigid, and the sound of his boots crunching against the gravel felt deafening in the stillness. He walked to the back of the truck, his breath coming out in cold clouds. When he rounded the corner, he froze. There, in the dim light of his truck's taillights, stood the man. The same man he had seen on the side of the road earlier. But now he was closer, standing just beyond the truck's rear. His eyes locked onto Jeff's, and Jeff felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the man's gaze was pulling him into some dark abyss. The man didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, smiling. It was a grotesque, wide grin, the kind of smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was inhuman. A primal terror gripped Jeff's chest. He knew he needed to leave, but his body wouldn't move. His feet felt frozen to the ground. The smile never wavered. In a surge of adrenaline, Jeff turned and ran back to the truck, fumbling with the door handle. He jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he slammed the truck into gear, speeding down the road. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but no explanation made sense. As Jeff drove, he kept glancing into the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind him. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the road, and he could barely see past the windshield. But every time he looked back, that figure was there, standing in the distance, watching him. It wasn't getting any closer, but it never seemed to disappear either. The miles stretched on, but as Jeff finally reached the next town, something was off. The gas station was dark, the lights flickering. It was too quiet. He pulled into the parking lot, his tires crunching on the gravel. He was exhausted, but the unease gnawed at him. That's when he saw it. The same broken down truck from earlier, parked in the lot. The one with the man standing beside it. He hadn't moved. Jeff's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. The man hadn't been standing by the side of the road. He had been following him the entire time. Jeff had been driving in circles, and the figure had been right there with him, always in the distance, always watching. He was trapped. Jeff never drove that route again. He left the trucking business not long after, unable to shake the fear of what he had seen. But every time he closed his eyes, he could still see that smile, the inhuman grin that had followed him no matter how far he drove. Late one night, trucker Steve was driving through a stretch of highway known for its isolation. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a dim glow over the barren landscape. He had been on the road for hours, alone, with nothing but the rumble of his engine and the hum of the tires against the asphalt to keep him company. The lights from his truck cut through the dense fog that clung to the road, but the visibility was still poor. His eyes were heavy, fighting the urge to close. He'd been pushing through for days, and the exhaustion was beginning to wear on him. As he navigated through the thick fog, he felt an uncomfortable chill in the air. Something about this stretch of road felt different tonight. It wasn't long before he spotted something in the distance. A pair of headlights, faint at first, grew larger as they approached from behind. It wasn't a car, it was another truck. He instinctively checked his mirrors and felt a knot tighten in his stomach. There was no reason to be nervous, he told himself. The highway was long, and sometimes other truckers passed each other at night. But this truck wasn't just passing him, it was gaining on him quickly. At first, Steve thought it was a fellow driver trying to overtake him, but as the truck pulled closer, he realized something was off. The truck wasn't moving in a normal fashion. It swerved slightly, as if the driver was struggling to keep control. As it passed, Steve could see the driver in the window, a man hunched over the wheel, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. For a split second, the driver locked eyes with Steve, and in that moment, Steve's heart skipped a beat. The man's face twisted into a grimace, his eyes filled with unspoken fear. Then, as if on cue, the truck veered violently off the road and vanished into the thick fog. It didn't crash, it didn't stop, it just disappeared. Steve's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He shook his head, telling himself it was just a trick of the fog, that he was exhausted and his eyes were playing tricks on him. But deep down, something didn't feel right. He pushed the thought aside and kept driving, but the unease gnawed at him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the truck behind him, but the road was empty. A few miles down the road, Steve pulled into a rest stop to stretch his legs and clear his mind. The place was eerily quiet, the gas station lights flickering in the distance. He stepped out of the truck and felt the cold air bite at his skin. As he walked around to the back of the truck to check the load, he heard something. A faint noise, like the sound of footsteps in the gravel. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He spun around, his heart pounding, but no one was there. The noise came again, this time closer, like someone was walking behind him. Panic surged through Steve's veins. He turned around, expecting to see another trucker or someone else on the road, but there was no one, just the fog and the empty stretch of highway. His eyes scanned the area, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there watching him. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He felt the unmistakable sensation of being followed. He turned quickly, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the fog, but again, nothing. Still, the feeling persisted. It was as if the road itself had taken on a life of its own, and Steve wasn't welcome here. His instincts screamed at him to get back in the truck and leave, but something kept him frozen in place. As he walked back to the truck, he noticed something strange: footprints, large, heavy impressions in the gravel leading up to the rear of his truck. Steve's heart stopped as he realized they weren't his. They were fresh, the prints deep and disturbed. Whoever, or whatever, had made them was close. Without thinking, Steve jumped into the truck, locking the doors behind him. His hands were trembling as he started the engine, eager to get back on the road. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. He glanced nervously at the mirrors, expecting to see someone following him, but the road was empty. The fog had thickened, swallowing the world around him. Hours passed, and Steve's exhaustion set in. He had driven for far too long without rest, and the isolation of the highway was beginning to play tricks on his mind. The silence was overwhelming, and he couldn't seem to escape the feeling that something was out there with him. He checked the mirrors again. Still nothing. But as the miles stretched on, something began to appear in the distance. A figure, standing by the side of the road, just outside the reach of his headlights. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the fog. Steve's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't explain why, but the sight of the figure filled him with an irrational terror. He couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but he wasn't about to find out. He sped past, his foot heavy on the gas, but the figure didn't disappear. It remained just out of sight in the fog. Every time he glanced in the mirror, it seemed to be closer. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but the terror kept building, his instincts screaming at him to get away. Steve drove faster, the engine roaring beneath him, but the figure never moved. It stayed in the distance, watching him, growing closer with every passing second. No matter how fast he drove, the figure was always there, looming in the fog just behind him, never going away. Finally, Steve couldn't take it anymore. He pulled into the next town, desperate for any sense of safety. But as he rolled into the parking lot of a truck stop, he froze. The same figure, now clearly visible, stood by the side of the road, just outside the lot. Its face was hidden in shadow, but the sense of dread that emanated from it was unmistakable. The figure had followed him all the way here. Steve never spoke about what happened that night, but he couldn't escape the feeling that something was still following him, watching him from the shadows. The road, the fog, the endless stretches of highway. He couldn't shake the sense that it all held a dark, malevolent force. And as he drove away the next morning, he swore he saw that figure in his rearview mirror one last time, just standing there, waiting for the next trucker to come along.
Story number 4.
The long stretches of highway were always a comfort to Danny. He had been driving trucks for over 25 years and had seen his share of weird, unsettling things. But nothing could prepare him for what happened on a lonely stretch of Route 68, deep in the heart of Kentucky. It was a route he knew well, but that night, something about it felt off. It was well after midnight, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that seemed to rise up out of nowhere. The road was empty, as it often was at this hour, with no other vehicles in sight for miles. He had just finished his last delivery and was on his way back to the depot, the long road ahead stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio was silent, the truck's engine humming beneath him. That was when he saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. Danny blinked. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes, with a hat pulled low over their face. He couldn't make out any details, but they were standing still, just standing there on the edge of the highway, staring into the darkness. Most truckers would keep driving. Pick up no one. It's one of the first rules you learn. But for some reason, Danny slowed his rig as he approached, the truck's brakes groaning as he eased it to a stop. The figure didn't move. Danny rolled down his window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice low, unsure why he was offering. The figure's head turned slowly, and when it looked at him, Danny felt his stomach drop. The face was pale, too pale, almost unnaturally so. But it wasn't just the color that unsettled him. It was the eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and completely black, like hollow voids that stared straight through him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that was eerily calm, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have stopped." Danny's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know why, but he suddenly had the overwhelming urge to drive away, to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. But he was frozen. The voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it seemed to reach inside him. "Why didn't you listen?" the figure asked again, its head tilting to one side, its black eyes never leaving his. Danny slammed the gear shift into drive without thinking, and the truck lurched forward, tires squealing as he sped down the road, glancing nervously in his rearview mirror. For a second, he thought he saw the figure follow him, just at the edge of his vision, moving at a pace too fast for a human. But when he looked again, it was gone. He didn't stop until he reached the next town, a small, rundown truck stop at the edge of the highway. The place was barely open, only a couple of other rigs parked in the lot, their drivers inside, oblivious to the fear still churning in Danny's gut. He pulled into a spot, trying to steady his shaking hands. His eyes kept flicking to the road behind him, but there was no sign of the figure. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him, that he wasn't alone. That was when he noticed something strange. The fog hadn't lifted. In fact, it seemed to have gotten thicker, almost as if it was moving, swirling around him, engulfing the truck. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just the weather. But then there was a sound, a knock, a soft tap. It came from the back of the truck, the freight door. His blood ran cold. There was no reason anyone should have been near the truck. He was parked far from the entrance, and the lot was empty. He slowly got out, trying to breathe through the tightness in his chest. The knocking came again, this time louder, more urgent. He reached for the back door handle, his body screaming at him to run, but he had to see. He had to know what it was. When the door swung open, what he saw took the air right out of his lungs. There was nothing there, no one, just a single, blood-soaked handprint smeared across the metal of the truck's interior. The smell hit him then, a sickly, sweet rot that seemed to come from nowhere. He stepped back, gasping for air, and that's when he heard the voice again, coming from somewhere inside the fog. "I told you not to stop." Danny didn't wait to find out what that thing wanted. He jumped back into the truck, locked the doors, and drove, not looking back until he hit the outskirts of the city. Even then, he wasn't sure if it had followed him, if the thing he'd seen was real, or if it had all been some kind of hallucination. But he never took that route again. And he never stopped for anyone on the side of the road, no matter what they looked like or how much they begged. Some roads were meant to be driven past, not stopped on. Some things were better left unseen.
Story number 5.
It was late in the evening when Tony started his route. He had been a trucker for over 15 years, and he knew how lonely and quiet the road could get. This time, he was driving through the winding mountain roads of West Virginia, taking a load of electronics to a warehouse on the outskirts of a small town. The roads were narrow and treacherous, the headlights from his rig barely cutting through the thick fog that seemed to rise from the ground and cling to everything. Tony had been driving for hours when he noticed something strange. Off in the distance, he saw the flickering lights of what looked like a campfire set far off the side of the road. It was out of place. There was no campground around here, and no reason for anyone to be out there. As he passed, he glanced over to the left, but the light was gone. He thought maybe it was just his tired eyes playing tricks on him. He shrugged it off and kept driving. About an hour later, the road started to feel eerily quiet. There were no other trucks in sight, no other vehicles for miles. It was just him and the mountain, and the thick fog seemed to make the silence even more suffocating. Tony's radio crackled to life, but it wasn't a voice he recognized. It was static, a low, almost imperceptible humming sound, like the voice was being distorted by something unnatural. He fiddled with the dial, trying to tune it out, when he saw something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his back hunched. At first, Tony thought it was just another hitchhiker, but something about it didn't sit right with him. The man wasn't waving for a ride. He wasn't even moving. He was just standing there, motionless in the fog. Tony's instincts kicked in. He sped up, wanting to put as much distance between himself and that figure as possible. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the road itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he rounded a bend, he caught sight of the man again, this time closer. The figure had moved, but there was no way he could have gotten that close. Tony's heart started to race. He was still alone on this stretch of road, and now the figure was walking towards him, the outline of his body barely visible in the fog. Tony slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt in the middle of the road. He couldn't move. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. In the reflection of his side mirror, he saw the man standing inches from his truck, his face now illuminated by the headlights. The face was wrong, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too wide, too hollow. The mouth was slack, hanging open, as though he had been waiting for Tony to notice him. Without thinking, Tony reached for the CB radio and turned it on. A low, garbled voice came through the static, but it wasn't speaking words, just a low, eerie humming sound. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Suddenly, the man jerked his head to the side, as if noticing Tony's gaze. His head twisted unnaturally far, an awful cracking sound following the movement. The man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, and his eyes locked with Tony's, glowing with something dark and unrecognizable. Tony's heart raced. His breath quickened. His mind screamed for him to move, to drive, to get away. But the figure was too close, and the fog had thickened around the truck, making it feel like it was closing in on him. He didn't know why, but in that moment, Tony felt a deep compulsion to look down. There, by the front bumper of his truck, was a trail of wet, dark red footsteps in the mist, leading directly to his door. The footprints weren't human, not exactly. They were far too large and far too wide. The skin on his arms began to prickle, the hairs rising as a sense of dread washed over him. Then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it was gone. The footsteps were gone. The fog started to thin, and the road stretched out in front of him, empty again, as though nothing had happened. Tony didn't wait another second. He threw the truck into gear and sped off, never looking back. His mind raced as the road seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of him. His hands trembled on the wheel, but he couldn't slow down. Something deep inside him told him to keep going, that if he stopped again, he might never get the chance to drive away. He reached the town just before dawn, and the first thing he did was check his truck. The air was still and quiet, and the fog had dissipated. There were no signs of any figures, no traces of the man, but the smell, that awful, sickly sweet odor, lingered in the air, even though he couldn't see anyone around. It clung to him, sinking into his clothes, making him feel like he wasn't alone. Tony never took that route again. He never spoke of it to anyone, not even his fellow truckers, but every time he passed through that stretch of highway, he felt it. The weight of something watching, waiting, just beyond the fog. He never stopped for anyone again, no matter how desperate they seemed. Some things on the road were meant to be left alone. Some things, once seen, could never be forgotten.
Story number 6.
It was late when Earl, a seasoned trucker with over 20 years behind the wheel, was driving down Route 82 in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. The roads were long and empty, with nothing but the hum of his truck's engine and the occasional flicker of his headlights cutting through the vast expanse of darkness. Earl was used to the solitude of the open road, but that night, something felt different. The air had a heavy, suffocating quality, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He had just finished a long haul from Denver and was headed towards Salt Lake City, looking forward to a brief stop at the next rest area. As he navigated the winding curves, he saw a set of headlights in the distance, growing larger as he approached. It was another truck parked along the shoulder. Earl didn't think much of it at first, but as he got closer, he noticed something strange. The truck was off, not running, with no driver in sight. Earl's gut twisted with unease, but he convinced himself that maybe the driver had just stepped out. But when Earl passed the truck, he saw something that made him slam his brakes. Just beyond the parked truck, there was a figure standing on the side of the road. A man, dressed in dirty, ragged clothes, but what stood out the most was the fact that he was just standing there, staring at the road with an unsettling, unnatural stillness. It was past midnight, and there were no other vehicles around, no reason for anyone to be standing there. Earl's hands tightened on the wheel, and he slowly rolled down his window. "Hey, you need a ride?" Earl called out, trying to ignore the chill creeping up his spine. The figure didn't move. No acknowledgement, no response. Earl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something was wrong. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the guy's stillness, his lack of any reaction, felt off. He was about to pull away when the man's head slowly turned towards him. Earl's heart skipped a beat. The eyes, black as coal, void of any light or life, locked onto his. There was nothing human about the stare, just a hollow emptiness. It felt as though the man was staring right through him. Without thinking, Earl slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding off into the night. His heart raced, and a cold sweat drenched his back. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing after him. But there was nothing. The road behind was empty. The silence in the cab felt oppressive, and Earl tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread. But the unease only grew as he drove further into the night. The wind picked up, howling through the truck's vents. Then, just as he thought he could relax, the radio crackled to life. It was nothing but static at first, a low, distorted hum. Earl adjusted the dial, trying to clear it, but then, through the static, came a voice. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have stopped." Earl's blood ran cold. The voice sounded like it was coming from just outside his window, but there was no one around. He gripped the wheel harder, his knuckles white. The fog that had started to roll in around the truck seemed to get thicker, more suffocating. He tried to push the panic down, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. A few miles later, the truck began to slow on its own, despite Earl's foot firmly pressing the accelerator. The engine sputtered, then died. Earl cursed under his breath, trying to restart it, but it wouldn't budge. He was stuck in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick fog, and now his truck wouldn't start. With a deep breath, Earl stepped out of the truck to check under the hood. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. As he stood there, flashlight in hand, he heard a noise. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching the gravel behind him. Earl's heart stopped. He slowly turned around, but no one was there. He dismissed it as nerves getting the best of him. But then the flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints. Large, deep impressions leading toward the truck. But they weren't human. They were too wide, too heavy, as if something much larger had walked there. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of Earl's neck stood up. He felt it again, the feeling that he was being watched. Without a second thought, he jumped back into the cab, locking the door behind him. The engine still wouldn't start, and the footsteps were getting closer, the sound now unmistakable. His mind raced, and all he wanted to do was get out of there. As the fog seemed to close in on him, Earl glanced out the window, dreading what he might see. There, standing in the fog, was the man from earlier. But this time, he wasn't just standing still. The figure was moving slowly toward the truck, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as if it couldn't quite figure out how to move properly. The truck started, suddenly, and Earl didn't waste a second. He slammed the gear shift into drive and floored the gas, the truck roaring to life and speeding off into the fog. His eyes never left the rearview mirror as the figure seemed to disappear into the mist. Earl didn't stop until he reached the nearest town, his mind reeling with the strange events. He pulled into a truck stop, still shaking, but the fog had lifted, and there was no sign of the man. He stepped out of the truck, checking it over, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. It was as if nothing had happened. But that sickly, metallic smell still lingered faintly in the air. Earl never spoke of that night to anyone, but every time he passed through that stretch of road again, he felt a cold chill settle in his chest. He never stopped for anyone again, no matter how desperate they seemed. Some things on the road were meant to be left alone, and some things once seen could never be forgotten.